Our emotions are a really important piece of our overall health. What we know is that negative emotions can do things like negatively impact your heart health or your immune system or your ability to cope. But we know that positive emotions have the opposite impact. They can improve heart health or immunity and our ability to be resilient about things. Emotions also affect our behaviors and our view of ourselves and other people. You can imagine how this might play out as it relates to your overall health. If you're struggling with a negative self view, for example, it might be difficult to engage in self care. That might look like not making or attending important health appointments or adhering to a treatment plan that might involve medication or something like a sleep device like a CPAP. Over time, those have secondary and tertiary effects that impact your health negatively. It can also affect the way that you relate to other people. And if you're struggling with relationships, it can mean that you're feeling alone. We know from research in social psychology that those of us that tend to have higher levels of social support and connection also report greater physical health. Sometimes we only notice our emotions when they present difficulties for us, so we can associate them with negativity. However, what we know is that our emotions have a lot of utility. If you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, they help to keep us safe. We need fear or anxiety and worry. A long time ago, our ancestors were worrying about if that squiggle on the ground was a snake, or if they ate that berry, would they die? Is that mound over there across the field going to run and attack me? A sense of heightened worry or awareness is part of our humanity, and there's a lot of importance in that. The experience of anxiety in and of itself, for example, is not negative. If you think about the times when it's helped you be a little bit more aware or on point, giving a presentation or adhering to requirements. If you're a little bit worried about getting caught doing something like riding without your seatbelt, you're more likely to do it. So there are some important social and emotional ramifications of our emotions. Our positive emotions are really important too. Joy and love are things that encourage us to form social connections, and our social support is vital for our emotional and physical well-being. We see problems with emotional regulation across different, what we would call disorders. What we know is that whether you're experiencing symptoms of depression or anxiety or PTSD, it all comes back to the idea of something we call psychological inflexibility. Now, what do I mean by this? So it sounds like a big word, but all it really boils down to is an unwillingness to deal with it and move forward based on that. So when we're being psychologically unflexible, we're working really hard to fight against what is in our life. This might be feelings of guilt or shame or a difficult emotion like depression or fear. But what happens is we often develop these compensatory ways of addressing them. Let's say that maybe you've gone through something traumatic in your life and that feels really scary and you don't want to address it. So every time you get reminded of it or you think you might have to deal with it, you engage in other behaviors that help you avoid, either literally or figuratively. Maybe you aren't going places where you used to see friends or engage in activities you used to avoid. Maybe you are engaging in things like using alcohol or substances to help numb those difficult experiences, or overspending, or reading too much, or playing video games. These are just some examples of ways that we can try to avoid. The problem is, in the short term, that might seem like it works, but it doesn't. The emotions don't go anywhere. The problems don't go anywhere. So we might have picked a fight with our partner to avoid dealing with a real issue, but the real issue is still there. That behavior, like all the other behaviors I mentioned, tends to create secondary problems that we have to deal with. We get looped right back around into where we started. Our goal is to help you develop what we call psychological flexibility, or the ability to stay present and face what is. And to help you do that, we help you identify what matters and how to stay present, how to change your relationship to these difficult emotions so that you can move towards what's important to you. When it comes to managing difficult emotions, it can be really helpful to do things like setting realistic goals. You want to be able to set small, achievable goals. When we get overwhelmed, a lot of times we feel like we should do something all at once or what we're doing isn't enough. If we can think about why that really matters to us, why the whole event in the first place was important, then we can say, okay, we'll think about that like a point out on the horizon that we're going to move to. Whether you take a tiny step or a really big step, it doesn't matter because you're still moving in that direction. It helps you get out of that all or nothing way of thinking about it. Like either I have to be at the destination or I'm not there at all, because that almost always results in defeat. It helps you have a lot of small wins. So for example, if, hey, I would really like to find a relationship and not having that makes me feel distressed all the time and I feel tearful and overwhelmed, then being able to think about ways that you can move towards connection, because that's the real value there, then that might be connection with yourself or with other people. It might be romantic partner or not. But if you're able to work on it from that perspective, then it can be really helpful. Some things that can help with feeling overwhelmed with emotion would be setting realistic goals, practicing self-compassion, practicing mindfulness, staying connected to others. If you're working on something like emotional regulation, it's important to remember that there will never be a time when there are no waves in the ocean. There are always going to be some waves to navigate. What we want to help you do is become a really good surfer. Emotions will always be present. Some might be positive in your opinion, some might be what we have labeled as negative, and others might be neutral or not even things that we're aware of. We might not notice them. But what matters most is your relationship to them. When it comes to language, oftentimes it's the meaning making that causes the problem. Be really mindful and careful of the stories that you're telling yourself. Something that can be really useful is when you're feeling distressed, ask yourself, what have I told myself about this situation? What does that mean for me? Because there might be a thought there that you could recognize and work on changing your relationship to. When it comes to making sense of our feelings, starting to change your relationship to them can seem a little odd at first. And there's a reason for this. What we know is that there is a linear relationship between our thoughts and our feelings. And this is based on something called cognitive theory. You can draw a line between, I have this thought and it results in this emotion. And a lot of times we're not aware of the thought behind the feeling. The reason for that is when we're making sense of the world, we learn something called automatic thinking. And that's really useful and functional. For example, when you're a little kid, you learn there are lots of different types of things. Learning about chairs, for example, you learn that there are office chairs and desk chairs and kitchen chairs and things like that. Then you might further parse things apart and learn, okay, this thing over here has 4 legs and a place to sit, but that's a side table. That's not a chair. So you're constantly sort of splitting hairs and parsing apart this knowledge. If you think about how much knowledge we have to take in as people making sense of the world around us, there's no way that every time you needed to navigate something, you could literally say to yourself, this has 4 legs and a place to sit, and so it is a chair and I will sit on it. You have automatic thinking about that, and you go A to Z before you even realize it. Usually that's exactly what we need it to be. Sometimes we have that same experience with thoughts that might be less helpful, things that we've learned along the way. This automatic thinking happens all the time. You don't even notice it. For example, you get in your car after you've learned how to drive and you arrive at your destination and you didn't even think about getting there. Same thing with making your coffee in the morning. It's not a problem, so you don't need to do any excavation as to what's going on with that. However, if you realize that you're having a lot of difficulty with your emotions, it could be in your relationships, it could be your relationship with yourself, then it can be really helpful to work with a cognitive behavioral therapist to do a little bit of digging and figure out what thought is behind this feeling that's causing me problems. A lot of times we'll teach skills that help clients figure out, okay, There were a lot of things that I said to myself in a given situation. However, I might have just noticed the feeling. So we'll help them do things to tease out the thoughts in between their first impression and what we call the hot thought or the problematic thought that might be at the bottom of that. We really help you get to the root of the problem. Part of that process can feel a little bit odd though, because we don't usually think about our thinking that way. So it becomes a bit of a meta conversation between you and yourself or you and your therapist, where we really talk about what you're thinking. And again, that's different because oftentimes you get on autopilot during your day. As you learn this skill, one thing that you'll start to develop is mindfulness or awareness of your emotions and being able to name them. There's a phrase we like to use called name it to tame it. If you're able to label your emotions or label your affect, your feeling, your presentation of your emotion, then it takes some of the power away from that feeling and gives it back to you. It lets you decide, yes, I've had this experience, but how do I want to respond to it? So you can be less reactive. We can teach you things like cognitive skills to better discern the thoughts that are getting you the emotional result. We can also teach you things like mindfulness that can help change your relationship to that thought once you've noticed that it's there. An example of that might be if you feel like you're struggling a lot with emotional regulation, it might feel like you're caught in a storm all the time. That's, of course, really distressing. But what mindfulness can help you do, and these cognitive skills can help you do, is to understand, okay, I have this distressing emotion resulting from this distressing thought, but I am an entity that is experiencing them. I am separate. So it's similar to noticing that the sky can experience a lot of different weather, but a storm does not change the sky. If that was true, one storm would result in a stormy sky forevermore. Unfortunately for us, that's not the case. All kinds of weather happens all the time, but the sky is a constant. We help you feel more like the sky and less like the weather.